90% of Canadians have fallen for fake news. That's according to a new poll for Canada's Centre for International Governance and Innovation. And most of that fake news is found on Facebook. So who is behind this misinformation and why do we fall for it? Sasha Havlicek is the CEO of a British think tank that studies online hate and disinformation. I sat down with her last week. Here's that conversation. Sasha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
A poll out this week that has a lot of Canadians talking, saying 90% of Canadians have fallen for fake news, which was defined as partially or wholly fake information. A lot of that coming through Facebook. Does that statistic surprise you?
And we haven't even got to deep fake, not yet, which is the technology that will really get us stomped on fake news. It doesn't entirely surprise me. News and information that's shared within peer groups tends to be more impactful. We tend to believe it a little bit more. It's worrying, but what we see in relation to misinformation today is that the picture is more complex than that. Because it isn't just about false information, or indeed false means of distributing that information through obvious botnets.
Who are the people that are behind this fake news and this disinformation, and why are they doing it?
Well, this is the thing, when everybody's been looking at this really since 2016, and everybody's been asking really the big question about Kremlin interference. Now, there is that happening, but what we're seeing is a much more complex set of actors. We're seeing transnational non-state actors very active here. The international alt-right has been as much of a player, I would say, as Kremlin sources across Europe, across a whole range of elections of late. And we see an investment in long-range campaigns around wedge issues.
Why is it that social media companies aren't doing more to counter this? Is it beyond their control? Is it not in their interest? What's the motivation?
So I think that there have been efforts by the companies to look at this sort of range of harms, if you like, from violent extremism through hate speech, through the misinformation space. Most of the approach that's been seen now to date, governments have been basically looking at this from a content moderation perspective, and they've been saying to the companies, you need to do more to moderate or to remove egregious and problematic content. And while there is content that definitely needs to be removed, and it's illegal, so there's a lot of hate speech that's illegal, there's harassment that's illegal, there's defamation that's illegal, we need to do more to apply existing laws online more effectively. That isn't happening very well right now. There's a whole lot, of course, that isn't that falls into the sort of gray area of legal but problematic content. This is where we need a new tack, we need a new approach. We need to be looking at this from the perspective of the technological architecture of these platforms that essentially tilts in favor of extremist messaging and polarization.
How do you go about countering something that has become so ingrained in something that's so much a part of our lives in social media?
I think you need a three-pronged approach to this. You need to see policy coming into play, and I do believe that regulation is absolutely necessary. The self-regulatory approach with the companies, I don't think is going to work, and that regulation needs to focus beyond content moderation on that architecture that I just talked about, the imbalances that we see online that tilt in favor of extremism. The second piece is really competition. We need to provide open data for civic actors to compete effectively for share of mind online in order to compete effectively with these extreme ideas. And we don't do that very effectively today. Civil society groups tend not to have the tools, they tend not to have access to the data at scale. It's, in a way, I think, something that both government and the companies could come around together to invest in that kind of machinery, to upskill and upscale the civic response. And then thirdly, there is an investment that needs to be made in education. And when we talk about education, sort of digital citizenship education, it shouldn't just be for kids. This should be for everybody.
What about some of the immediacy that the technology allows? And I think of the terrible attack in New Zealand in March. This is somebody who had a GoPro attached to himself, was live broadcasting his attack. How much of a challenge is it to deal with something like that and the propaganda value that that holds when you can now reach out to hundreds of thousands of people around the world in an instant?
Well, it's a huge potential, of course. And one of the things I would say is that that attack gave us an insight into the wider ecosystem of these extremist groups. the manifesto, the so-called manifesto that the attacker put out, was put out on an alt tech platform. So you see a number of platforms either being co-opted or being set up and created for the purposes of obviating some of the restrictions that we've seen on the mainstream platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. And so you have this entire ecosystem now of alternative platforms that enable sort of rabid engagement and communications in sort of nether regions of the internet, where a lot of the plotting and planning and deployment of information operations happens. And then there needs to be a much better crisis response system in place, so that governments and the tech companies, when an attack like this happens, are able to respond in a much tighter time frame.
We're in an election year. What should Canadians be prepared for in this election, and what's the possible fallout and consequences of this kind of disinformation being fed into the campaigns?
I think one has to be prepared for the fact that there is a whole plethora of actors that will be interested to sow the seeds of polarization, potentially hate, but also sort of tilt the system in perhaps favor of one or another party. It's not just foreign state actors. It is a combination of non-state transnational actors working often with domestic extreme actors. We've seen in the European context that bleed into populist party actors. And one of the challenges is to distinguish between those and be able to develop a response. I think we need to be watching much more closely the extent to which the social media companies' commitments around, for instance, political ads transparency is being delivered on.
Sasha, thank you so much.
Thank you.